Harlem, New York. 11:06 a.m. Tuesday, March 13, 1951. The windows of PS 139 rattled every time the elevated train screamed past on Lenox Avenue. Chalk dust floated in the stale air, mixing with the smell of wet wool coats and old radiator heat. Outside, a cold rain tapped against the glass in a slow, relentless rhythm that matched the tension building inside room 3B. 28 black children sat in stiff wooden desks, hands folded, eyes forward, all of them knowing that when the white teacher got that particular look in her eyes, silence was survival. At the front of the class stood Miss Eleanor Whitfield, 38 years old, Brooklyn-born, a woman who believed the classroom was a battlefield where discipline meant destruction, and respect was earned through humiliation. Her gray skirt suit was pressed to military precision, her hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent sneer. She had been teaching in Harlem for 6 years, and every single day of those 6 years, she made it clear she didn't ask for this assignment. In the second row, third seat from the window, sat a quiet 12-year-old boy in a hand-me-down sweater, collar slightly frayed but clean and pressed. His name was William Johnson. Most people called him Will. Only a few knew who his father was. Miss Whitfield knew. 11:07 a.m. The assignment was simple. Stand, introduce yourself, say what you wanted to be when you grew up. The children before him had answered with small dreams said in small voices. Nurse, mechanic, teacher. When it was his turn, Will rose slowly to his feet, his voice soft but clear. I want to be a lawyer, ma'am. The room exhaled a faint murmur. Miss Whitfield turned from the blackboard, chalk still in her hand. She looked him up and down with clinical precision, from his scuffed shoes to his serious eyes. A thin smile cut across her face, but there was no warmth in it. A lawyer, she repeated, letting the word hang in the air like smoke. And what makes you think people like you ever become lawyers, William? What happened next lasted exactly 14 minutes. 14 minutes of systematic humiliation that would be reported to Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson by 2:17 p.m. The same day, she made him stand while she recited every stereotype, every limitation, every barrier that his race would supposedly create. She used words that made 3 children gasp and 2 others look down at their desks in shame. She wrote the word criminal on the blackboard in large, hard letters, then underlined it twice while staring directly at Will. Look at the word, William, she said, pointing the chalk at his chest. This is your future. This is all any of you will ever be if you keep listening to people like your father. Harlem trash pretending to be respectable. Will didn't cry. He had been taught better. He sat down without a word, jaw locked, ears burning. But across town, 4 blocks away, in a dimly lit back room above a Lenox Avenue restaurant, his father was about to learn exactly what had happened in room 3B. 11:11 a.m. A young boy from PS 139 ran into that restaurant soaked with rain, lungs burning, eyes wide with panic. By 2:17 p.m., Bumpy Johnson would know every word, every gesture, every moment of his son's humiliation. By 2:20 p.m., he would make 2 phone calls. By Friday morning, PS 139 would be permanently closed. Miss Eleanor Whitfield would be on a Greyhound bus leaving New York City, and every teacher, every administrator, every parent in Harlem would understand a lesson that didn't require a classroom. There are lines you don't cross, and children you don't touch. The story of how Eleanor Whitfield lost everything is a warning that history has tried to hide. If you enjoy these deep dives into the underworld, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support keeps these investigations alive. Now let's go back to Tuesday, March 13, 1951, Harlem, New York. 8:15 a.m. Tuesday, March 13, 1951. The morning bell at PS 139 did not signal the beginning of education. It announced the daily enforcement of hierarchy. Black children filed into classrooms where seating arrangements told the truth more clearly than any policy document. Back rows held the worn desks with wobbly legs and carved initials. Front rows, closest to sunlight and blackboards, remained reserved for the handful of white students whose families hadn't yet fled to the suburbs. This invisible border was understood by every child without explanation. In the staff room, Principal Harold Klein delivered his daily philosophy over burnt coffee. Order came through fear. Fear came through systematic degradation. These children needed to understand their place before they could learn anything else. It was a doctrine that had governed PS 139 since he took control in 1947. Eleanor Whitfield carried that philosophy like a weapon. Raised in Brooklyn during the 1920s, she was the daughter of Sergeant Thomas Whitfield, a man who spoke of black citizens not as people, but as a tide that needed containment. Her previous teaching assignment in Flatbush had ended after white parents complained about her severity. The Board of Education solved the problem by transferring her to Harlem as punishment. She had been exiled to teach children she fundamentally believed were unteachable, and every day for 6 years she made sure they knew it. 4 blocks away, Mame Johnson stood behind her son William, straightening his collar with practiced precision. The fabric was worn but clean, pressed with care that spoke of dignity maintained against impossible odds. Her daily warning was ritual: never mention your father's name, never speak about his business, never give anyone reason to connect you to the world he controlled. Will carried the weight of 2 identities. At school, he was just another black boy trying to survive. At home, he was the son of the most powerful man in Harlem, a fact that brought no comfort, only pressure to prove he was better than the streets. By 11:06 a.m., Will stood in room 3B, preparing to answer a simple question about his future. When he said he wanted to be a lawyer, Eleanor Whitfield's expression shifted into something cold and surgical. What followed was 14 minutes of calculated destruction. She didn't just mock his ambition, she dissected it with precision, using language designed to cut deep and leave permanent scars. She made him repeat phrases that denied his worth, forced other students to vocally agree that his kind had no business dreaming beyond manual labor or crime. The word she wrote on the blackboard was meant to define him permanently. Criminal. She underlined it twice, each stroke of chalk a judgment, then announced to the entire class that his father was exactly why none of them would ever escape Harlem's boundaries. Will sat down without tears, jaw-locked, maintaining the composure his mother had taught him. But Sarah Mitchell, sitting 3 rows back, had already made her decision. She didn't look down like the others. She looked furious. At 11:21 a.m., Will decided not to tell his father. By 11:23 a.m., that decision was no longer his to make, as Sarah ran out the building toward Lenox Avenue. Sarah Mitchell burst through the door of Coleman's barbershop at 11:25 a.m., chest heaving, school uniform soaked from rain and panic. Mr. Coleman stopped mid-cut, razor suspended in air, reading the alarm in her eyes before she spoke. In Harlem, information traveled through channels the police could never intercept, and Coleman's chair was the first station in that network. She didn't need to explain why she was there instead of in class. She simply whispered Johnson and Humiliated, and Coleman understood immediately that this wasn't schoolyard gossip. This was a declaration of war against the neighborhood's silent king. The relay system engaged with military precision. At 11:42 a.m., the story reached Marcus Quick Williams, a numbers runner making his morning collections on 135th Street. Coleman relayed it with surgical accuracy, adding context about Eleanor Whitfield's history and her police sergeant brother's protection. Quick carried it to the kitchen entrance of Small's Paradise by 12:15 p.m., where a porter added details about Principal Klein's reputation and the school's documented pattern. Each person in the chain understood their role. Information moved like precision machinery, growing more detailed and more damning with every transfer. At 2:17 p.m., Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat in the back room of Small's Paradise, conducting business with 3 policy bankers and a union representative. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of counted money. Financial ledgers covered the mahogany table. When Quick entered and whispered the request for a private word, Bumpy excused the room without explanation. Business could wait. This was personal. He listened to the full account with forensic attention, his face revealing nothing while his questions revealed everything. He wanted witnesses identified by name. He wanted the exact sequence of events time-stamped. He wanted Eleanor Whitfield's full name, her address, her background. He asked about the other teachers' reactions, the principal's knowledge, whether this was an isolated incident or part of a pattern. Quick provided every detail Sarah had given, plus the additional intelligence gathered during the relay. Bumpy's response was complete stillness that lasted exactly 47 seconds. No raised voice, no visible anger, just calculated silence. Then he made 2 strategic phone calls. The first reached a clerk in the Board of Education office, a woman who supplemented her salary by providing information to certain interested parties. The second went to an associate in Brooklyn who specialized in background investigations. Both conversations lasted under 2 minutes. Both ended with specific instructions and tight deadlines. Information is ammunition. Emotion is waste. Precision is power. This philosophy had been forged over 3 decades of survival in a world where rage was a luxury he could never afford, and strategy was the only currency that mattered. By 4:30 p.m., a manila folder sat on his desk containing Eleanor Whitfield's complete profile. Home address in Washington Heights. Annual salary of $3,200. Banking information showing a modest savings account at Manufacturers Trust. Teaching record with 4 documented complaints from previous districts. Most importantly, the complete service record of her brother, Sergeant Patrick Whitfield of the 32nd Precinct, who had been shielding her from consequences for 6 years. At 5:00 p.m., Bumpy summoned his inner circle to the back room. 5 men arrived within 20 minutes, expecting orders for physical violence. Instead, he laid out a strategy of systematic destruction with clinical precision. They would dismantle her life piece by piece using leverage, pressure, and the complete withdrawal of protection she didn't know she had. This wasn't about violence. Violence was messy. Violence brought police heat. He wasn't interested in hurting Eleanor Whitfield. He was interested in erasing her. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a single black chess piece on the center of the table. The sound of wood hitting mahogany echoed like a gavel. The school closes in 48 hours. Not a window broken, not a hand raised. We do this with precision. Wednesday, March 14th, 1951. 6 a.m. The operation began with financial strangulation, executed with the precision of a surgical strike. Bumpy Johnson understood that institutions survived on money, and money in Harlem moved through channels he controlled with absolute authority. Before sunrise, 4 phone calls reached 4 businessmen whose legitimate enterprises had been quietly feeding the Board of Education for years. Samuel Green, who owned 3 funeral homes that buried half of Harlem's dead. Marcus Washington, whose construction company had built a dozen school additions across Manhattan. Theodore Banks, who operated the largest dry cleaning chain in Upper Manhattan and pressed the uniforms of half the school district's staff. James Crawford, who controlled 24 rental properties and housed 3 school board members at below-market rates. Each man owed Bumpy favors that could never be refused, debts that extended far beyond money into the realm of survival itself. By 7:30 a.m., $52,000 in annual contributions had been withdrawn from Board of Education accounts. The condition for restoration was delivered with bureaucratic precision, an immediate and comprehensive review of staffing policies at PS 139, with particular attention to racially motivated misconduct. No names were mentioned. The implication carried the weight of a death sentence. Target 2 required more delicate precision. Sergeant Patrick Whitfield of the 32nd Precinct had built his little empire on protection, using his badge as armor against complaints from black parents whose grievances disappeared into filing cabinets. But his authority existed only because Bumpy allowed it to exist. 3 precinct captains operated illegal gambling operations under Sergeant Whitfield's supervision. Dice games and numbers running that generated more income than their police salaries. At 8 a.m., Bumpy's primary enforcer made visits to each captain in locations chosen to make them uncomfortable, the back rooms of their own gambling establishments. The conversation was brief and delivered in the same calm tone Bumpy used when discussing weather. Sergeant Whitfield had become a liability. His continued presence in the precinct threatened the stability of arrangements that had been profitable for everyone involved. The ultimatum was presented as a business decision: transfer him to the furthest possible precinct within 24 hours, or watch every gambling operation in the 32nd shut down permanently. By 8:45 a.m., transfer paperwork was moving through administrative channels with unusual speed. At 9:15 a.m., Principal Harold Klein arrived at his office to find an unmarked manila envelope positioned precisely in the center of his desk. Inside were 12 photographs taken with professional clarity, documenting his weekly poker games in the school basement. The images showed him handling cash skimmed from the cafeteria budget, student activity funds, and supply money. Beneath the photographs lay detailed ledgers documenting 18 months of embezzlement, accurate to the penny, complete with account numbers and transaction dates. A single typed note accompanied the evidence: PS 139's staffing decisions will be reviewed. Cooperate fully. No threats were written, none were necessary. While institutional pressure mounted, psychological warfare began in room 3B. Eleanor Whitfield arrived at 8:30 a.m. to find her classroom door slightly ajar, despite having locked it securely the previous evening. Nothing was missing, but everything was wrong. Her perfectly aligned chalk lay scattered across the tray. Her lesson planner had been moved 3 inches to the left. Her grade book sat at a different angle. The violation was subtle enough to question, obvious enough to unsettle. On the center of her desk, positioned with deliberate care on top of her attendance ledger, sat a single black pawn. She picked it up with trembling fingers, the smooth wood cold against her palm, understanding instinctively that her world had been entered by forces beyond her comprehension. By noon, the first pillar of her defense collapsed entirely. Sergeant Patrick Whitfield's voice cracked through the telephone line, stripped of its usual confidence and authority. His captain had just informed him of an immediate transfer to Staten Island, the furthest possible precinct from Harlem. The decision came from levels of authority he couldn't challenge, couldn't appeal, couldn't understand. His parting words carried the weight of abandonment. "Ellie, I can't help you with anything up there anymore. Something massive is moving against you. Be very careful who you've crossed." Outside the school walls, Harlem's network completed its mobilization with the efficiency of a military operation. The story of Will Johnson's humiliation traveled from Coleman's barbershop to Mrs. Washington's beauty salon, from the basement of Abyssinian Baptist Church to the corner store on 125th Street. Church ladies discussed it over afternoon coffee, their voices carrying the weight of collective judgment. Shop owners debated it between customers, each conversation adding details and context. Barbers shared it during cuts, their customers carrying the story to every corner of the neighborhood. Everyone knew what happened to Will Johnson. Everyone knew the name Whitfield. Everyone understood that Bumpy Johnson had taken this personally, and when Bumpy took something personally, the consequences extended far beyond individual punishment into the realm of community justice. By late afternoon, parents weren't just picking up their children from PS 139, they were gathering outside the building, not protesting, not shouting, simply standing in silent, unified judgment. Their eyes turned toward the second-floor window of room 3B with expressions that needed no translation. Eleanor went home to an empty apartment, the silence pressing against her like a physical weight. She sat at her kitchen table grading papers with hands that trembled despite her efforts at control. At 6:47 p.m. her telephone rang with the sharp urgency of an alarm. She answered on the second ring, expecting her brother's voice, hoping for reassurance. Instead, a voice she didn't recognize spoke with calm, terrifying precision. The words were delivered without emotion, without anger, with the clinical detachment of a surgeon announcing a diagnosis. You had 14 minutes to destroy a child's dreams. I have 34 hours to destroy yours. The line went dead before she could respond, leaving her alone with the dial tone and the growing certainty that her world was ending with the same systematic precision with which she had tried to end a 12-year-old boy's future. Thursday, March 15, 1951. 7 a.m. The parents assembled outside PS 139 with the disciplined silence of soldiers taking positions on a battlefield. They carried no signs, chanted no slogans, made no demands. They simply stood in formation along the sidewalk, faces turned toward the building's entrance, creating a living wall of judgment that every arriving staff member would be forced to navigate. Mothers in worn coats despite the early hour. Fathers in work uniforms who had delayed their morning shifts. Grandparents who had witnessed decades of systematic humiliation and recognized this moment as something final. Inside the building, the infrastructure collapsed with surgical precision. The milk delivery truck experienced sudden mechanical problems precisely when it reached the Harlem route, while every other school received service on time. 17 cafeteria workers called in sick simultaneously with identical symptoms. The heating coal delivery was mysteriously rerouted to a warehouse in the Bronx due to paperwork errors that would take days to correct. By 8 a.m., PS 139 operated without breakfast service, without heat, without the basic infrastructure that made education possible. At 9:30 a.m., Eleanor Whitfield approached the building and encountered the full force of community verdict. As she neared the entrance, the parents executed a gesture more devastating than any shouted insult. They turned their backs to her in complete unison. No words were spoken, no threats were made. She was forced to walk through their collective shunning, invisible yet simultaneously the center of absolute attention. Across town, the Harlem Gazette editor opened his morning mail to find 6 years of meticulously documented evidence. Witness statements from former students describing systematic racist abuse. Letters from parents whose complaints had disappeared into filing cabinets. Transcripts of staff room conversations recorded by custodial workers who had been listening for years. The documentation was forensic in its completeness, accompanied by a single typed note: "The community deserves to know who teaches their children." Principal Klein's panic escalated with each phone call from downtown administrators, demanding immediate explanations for the sudden withdrawal of $52,000 in funding and the surge of community complaints that had materialized overnight. He sat in his locked office, staring at the photographs of his illegal poker games, understanding that his survival now depended on cooperation with forces he couldn't identify. At 2:15 p.m., Eleanor returned from lunch to find her classroom windows wide open despite having locked them personally. Her lesson plans lay scattered across the floor by wind that shouldn't have been able to enter a locked room. On her desk, positioned with deliberate precision, sat a handwritten note on expensive stationery, hour 26. The isolation intensified with mechanical precision. Teachers who had worked alongside her for years found reasons to avoid the staff room when she entered. The custodial staff stopped cleaning her classroom. The school secretary refused to take phone messages or accept mail on her behalf. Eleanor had become a ghost haunting her own workplace, visible but untouchable. By evening, her brother called from Staten Island, his voice hollow with defeat. The transfer was permanent. His captain had made it clear that any attempt to interfere with Harlem business would result in consequences extending beyond his career into criminal prosecution. He was powerless, and they both knew it. Eleanor stayed late to grade papers, clinging to routine as the last defense against chaos. At 8:30 p.m., she heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate. The lights went out. Every fluorescent tube died simultaneously, plunging the second floor into complete darkness. From the blackness, a voice spoke with calm precision, close enough that she could feel the words in the air between them. 14 hours remaining, Miss Whitfield. Friday, March 16, 1951. 6 a.m. Eleanor Whitfield woke to the brutal cold of an apartment stripped of its heat. The radiator pipes stood silent, their usual hissing replaced by dead metal. A notice under her door apologized for emergency boiler repairs of indeterminate duration, though every other tenant reported normal heating. When she reached for the telephone, the line produced only silence. No dial tone. No connection to the outside world. The systems she had always assumed would answer to her had quietly turned away without explanation. While she shivered in Washington Heights, the Board of Education convened an emergency session at 7:15 a.m. 12 administrators reviewed the cascade of disasters that had materialized in 48 hours. $52,000 in withdrawn funding. Community complaints that had multiplied from 0 to 47 overnight. Media inquiries about documented patterns of racist abuse. Legal threats from attorneys whose names carried weight in City Hall. The vote to suspend Eleanor Whitfield pending investigation was unanimous and took less than 4 minutes. Self-preservation required sacrifice, and she had become expendable the moment her usefulness ended. At 8 a.m., Eleanor arrived at PS 39 to find the building encircled by forces beyond her comprehension. Parents stood 3 rows deep along the sidewalk. Reporters positioned themselves with cameras ready. 3 men in expensive suits introduced themselves as legal representatives filing class action litigation for educational malpractice and civil rights violations. The scene had been choreographed with precision, each element designed to document her fall for public record. Principal Harold Klein waited at the entrance. Termination papers clutched in visibly shaking hands. 2 security guards flanked him, not for her protection, but to ensure her removal. He couldn't meet her eyes as he delivered the words that ended her career. Effective immediately. You are to collect your personal effects under supervision and vacate the premises. His voice cracked under the strain of his own compromised position, understanding that her destruction was a warning meant equally for him. The final humiliation unfolded with surgical precision. Eleanor was escorted through the front doors she had entered with authority for 6 years, now flanked by guards as if she were a criminal. The same parents whose children she had systematically degraded stood in silent witness as she carried her belongings in a cardboard box. No one jeered. No one celebrated. They simply watched with expressions that combined vindication and grim satisfaction, bearing witness to justice delivered without a single raised fist. At 11:00 a.m., the Board of Education announced PS 139's immediate closure for comprehensive administrative review. The language was bureaucratic and neutral, but everyone in Harlem understood the real message. The institution had been shuttered as punishment for tolerating racism, accomplished through strategic pressure rather than violence. The community's reaction was not celebration. There were no street parties, no public boasting. What spread through Harlem was something colder, grim satisfaction. Justice had been executed using the system's own mechanisms against itself. By afternoon, Eleanor stood at the Port Authority bus terminal, one-way ticket to Cleveland gripping in her hand. Her teaching career was finished, her reputation destroyed beyond repair. Her brother's protection had evaporated. She was being erased from New York with the same systematic precision she had used to try breaking a 12-year-old boy's dreams. As she boarded the Greyhound bus, a porter approached with an envelope bearing her name in elegant script. Inside, a single sentence on expensive stationery delivered the final verdict. You tried to break a child. Harlem broke your future. The lesson is complete. PS 139 never reopened. The building stood as a hollow monument on Lenox Avenue, its windows dark, its playground silent, its doors chained shut by bureaucratic decree. The Board of Education redistributed 412 students across 3 other Harlem schools, each now operating under strict new oversight policies that included community review boards and mandatory bias training. Parent committees were formed with veto power over hiring decisions. The transformation was complete. Authority without community respect had been proven temporary. Eleanor Whitfield's erasure was surgical and permanent. By summer, she was working as a store clerk in the basement of a Cleveland department store, selling hosiery under her mother's maiden name. Every teaching application she submitted disappeared into rejection without explanation. The education community operated on networks of reference and reputation, and her name had been circulated through channels that guaranteed she would never stand before students again. She lived the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, haunted by the efficiency with which her existence had been dismantled. The woman who once commanded Room 3B with absolute authority now folded merchandise in fluorescent-lit anonymity, a ghost haunting her own life. Principal Harold Klein's collapse followed with mathematical precision. The photographs of his embezzlement reached the right desks at the right time. Forced resignation came first, followed by divorce when his wife discovered the gambling and theft. Legal fees consumed his savings and pension. By autumn, the man who once ruled PS 139 through fear was working night security at a Queens warehouse, watching over empty boxes in the dark, his authority reduced to checking locks and walking empty corridors until dawn. The destruction sent shockwaves through the entire district. 4 other teachers in Harlem schools, each with documented histories of racial complaints and whispered prejudices, submitted quiet resignations within 6 weeks. No formal charges were filed, no public accusations were made. They simply looked at the empty shell of PS 139, reviewed their own histories, and understood that the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. The days of unaccountable humiliation were over. William Johnson thrived in his new environment. Transferred to PS 157 under Principal James Robertson, a black educator who had fought his way through Columbia University and believed every child deserved to dream without limitation, Will found himself encouraged rather than destroyed. His ambition to become a lawyer was no longer a punchline but a possibility. Teachers encouraged his questions. Classmates saw him not as the boy at the center of a storm, but as a quiet student with sharp eyes and sharper focus. By semester's end, He was leading his class in civics and debate. One evening in late spring, Bumpy sat with his son in the back room of Small's Paradise, a worn chessboard positioned between them. Will moved his knight with the careful deliberation of someone learning strategy from a master. Bumpy corrected his positioning with gentle precision before delivering the lesson that would define his son's understanding of power. "Power isn't about fear, son," Bumpy said, his voice low and steady as he moved a rook across the board, taking a pawn without aggression, just simple, undeniable geometry. "It's about making people understand that actions have consequences. You protect your family, your community, your dignity, not with fists, but with precision. A fist breaks a bone that heals in 6 weeks. Precision breaks a life that never recovers." As Bumpy explained pawns, rooks, and bishops, he drew silent parallels to parents, businesses, and officials. Every piece had a role. Every move had consequences. Sometimes power meant taking a piece off the board. Sometimes it meant closing the board entirely. Will watched the black and white figures take their positions, understanding that he was learning more than chess. The incident transformed Bumpy's reputation in ways violence never could. He evolved from feared gangster to something more complex, a community protector who understood that systematic oppression required systematic response. Parents began bringing him complaints about discriminatory landlords, employers who refused to hire qualified black workers, merchants who charged higher prices in Harlem than downtown. He became a court of last resort, operating in the shadows but delivering results in the light. The story became Harlem folklore, passed down through barbershops, church basements, and kitchen tables. Grandmothers told it to grandchildren. Barbers recounted it to new customers. It evolved into legend while remaining rooted in truth, a warning passed from one generation to the next about the consequences of disrespecting the community's children. In 48 hours, Bumpy Johnson didn't just close a school. He established a principle that would govern Harlem for the next decade: touch our children, and we don't just fight back, we erase you from the equation entirely.